Is a very timely discussion, I think, as we all wonder quite what's going to happen in the election. Everyone expects it to be a clear big majority, but maybe there are other people now we've been talking about here, maybe coalitions and all that sort of thing are starting to happen. So where will London be in a sort of certainly different context of away from these Tory views about levelling up and levelling down? So, Tony, looking forward very much to hearing what you've got to say.
It's all right, I will do a little bit of general and London-style general election when we get there. But just whenever I hear discussion of elections and the certainty of the outcome, at the moment we're all, it's very hard not to believe that the outcome is what the polls are suggesting. But I'm always reminded of, and I take this in the spirit it's intended, most people in the room will be old enough to remember Monty Python, and their election night sketch, which begins with the first result coming through and the presenter, the Dimbleby figure, turning to the expert, the academic expert, thinly disguised version of David Butler, says to him, "Well, David, what do you make of that result?" To which the expert replies, "This result was very much as I predicted, except the other party won." Which, always brings me up short when I'm thinking about dead certainties. Anyway, what I want to do this evening is, Peter and I briefly discussed this title during the snowless season that comes before this season, spring. And obviously, there were going to be London and general elections in 2024. We didn't know that actually on this warm June evening, we were 10 days out from the actual general election. So I will say a bit about politics, but I want, in the best traditions of any lecture of this kind, to start by looking back. I want to, especially given where we are physically, just sort of make the point, and I know everybody in this room knows this, and you've seen this, you know it intuitively, you know it intellectually, but I think it is just worth reminding ourselves how much London can change in a relatively short time. Though it's a near eternal city, it can change, spin on a sixpence, whatever they are. Was it a throw? And by the way, if anybody wants to ask or say something as we go along, feel free to. We don't need to wait till the end. But I thought, as we are, I'd just like to look at the endless change and outward growth of the place, which are very important features of explaining Whither. So before we get to the future, I do want to look for a moment at the past. And this is where we are, here, more or less looking out from where we are that way, looking north. And of course, this is what the same view, exactly in the same orientation, looked like at the end of the Second World War. This area, everywhere but St Paul's Cathedral itself, was extensively bombed. And of course, as all of you will know, that is the second effort at replacing this, because this is what lay here before. This is looking down Paternoster Row from the east to the west in the late 19th century with these sturdy Victorian, I'm guessing, well they are, aren't they, sturdy Victorian buildings. And here's the first effort after that had happened to replace it in the 60s. This is William Holford's scheme. There's the view down that way. So looking through, not quite on the orientation of Paternoster's Road today, but very, very close to it. I think this is more or less the top of the building we're in is there. That's where the views were taken in the previous one. So I know we all know this, and it's not only true of the city, but it is particularly true of the city. I'm sure I've been told in the past that no square mile in the world has been built and rebuilt as much as the City of London. And I must say, if you look at this, it's extraordinary how much it does get built and rebuilt. Whatever you think about that, and forgive me if any of the architects are in the room, I suspect it will survive a bit longer than that. Anyway, moving swiftly on. Now, I said the city grows. And this is just a way of looking at that. Here we've got the city where we are, the original city of London, the Roman city, what for a long period really, from the Romans leaving, the Anglo-Saxons restarting it just outside, then moving back, all the way through till sort of Tudor England. The city was overwhelmingly inside the city, and then, despite efforts to stop its spread during the Tudor period, it started to grow out during the Regency period further out, and by 1889 it was actually bigger than the LCC area shown here. It was already further out to East and West Ham. And then, of course, after, predictably, in London, 40 or 50 years of discussion, Greater London was created in 1965. But of course, and I'll come back to this later, the area in blue round here are areas around London where more people commute into central London than work in that district itself. So an area ripe, if you were the kind of person working in Whitehall who liked lines on maps, to say, well, next time we have a reorganisation, we'll take it out to there. Of course, they'd all oppose it, make it much easier. Well, it would have made it much easier for the Conservatives to win it in the past. Not sure so much now, currently. But the point is, and even beyond this, in this area around it, what's now called the wider southeast, all of this is part of the London, of London really, of the London economy. Certainly economic geographers think of this as London. This enormous capacity to grow and to grow out and then to grow out further, facilitated by a most remarkable rail system, by the way. I don't know if any of you read the rather bleak article in the FT over the weekend about the north of England and about the efforts to scale it up and give it better railways and contrasting it inevitably with London. So, focused on more or less where we are, one of the world's most extensive, probably only Tokyo has a more extensive railway system than the one we're sitting in the middle of. Now, in recent history, London's population reached its zenith in 1939, slightly misleading in the sense that that was within the Greater London area as we think of it today, but as this figure shows, you've got inner London's population up here then, and outer London's down there. And as we move forward to the point when it reached its minimum, inner London was almost 45% lower, had a 40 or 45% lower population, partly because the kind of housing that many people in this room live in had many more people living in it at the time in dismal and overcrowded conditions. How many people in the room live in a house where that would have been true? I know some of you do, yeah, there we are. So, homes that had 15 or 16 people living in them in the past, certainly 8 or 9, now have 1 or 2 or 3. So a lot of the decline in inner London was actually moving towards less overcrowding. Outer London continued to grow, so even at the point when London's population reached its nadir in 1986, down from 8.6 in just before 1939 here, just after that actually, and then grew thereafter all the way through to reaching its current figure of around 9 million. Easier to say that with certainty if the Office for National Statistics had produced up-to-date population estimates since the census. But there we are, about 9 million, and I'll come back to this as well, projected to grow slightly more gently than in the remarkable decade. If you look between 1991 to 2000 to 2011, extraordinary growth there, all the way through to 2021, levelled off a bit now for all sorts of reasons, but still projected to go up. So remarkable change there. However, too many numbers here, and anybody who wants these slides, you're very welcome to them. But this is simply looking at the population of London within the wider southeast since 1961. So since 1961, those of you with incredibly good eyesight will see that London's population has gone from effectively 8 million to 9 million. So up 1 million. No, went down then came back. So up 1 million since 1961. But if you look at the wider southeast, so that's the east and the southeast region, but take London out of them, the population in that area, where, by the way, apparently nothing is ever built because of NIMBYism, its population has gone up from 9.5 million to 15.4. So by 6 million, 6 Birminghams have been added to the southeast and the east at a time when London has gone up by 1 million. And that has a profound implication for the United Kingdom, because it means, as in many countries around the world, not unique to the UK, people moving, as Ed Glazer, the American academic urbanist, right, they're moving towards the better weather. Because if you control for everything else in the US, people move south towards the better weather. They retire to the south, they move to the south. And something like that's going on within the United Kingdom. Now, this is an inexorable, unstoppable issue. Remember, the Jarrow March marched south. Every government since the 50s has tried to do something to stop this continuing to get more like this. And there was another piece in the FT by Janan Ganesh recently, wondering whether there were some insoluble public policy problems. And the one he put at the top of the list was regional redistribution and stopping the wider southeast growing and growing and growing relative to the rest of the country. Every government has tried to do it, and this is the result. Now, that's not, of course, there have been changes. There were periods when London was in significant relative and absolute decline, but I think most economic geographers would argue that had less to do with policy, though some of it at the margin might have had to do with policy, but much more to do with deindustrialisation, people's decision to move to bigger, cheaper housing a bit further out, and all the other things that continually affect London's relationship with its wider region. I took two, the internet's full of this stuff. Ships Nostalgia, a great name for a website. So Ships Nostalgia, could be Liverpool, could be New York, could be anywhere really. But anyway, this apparently was the docks. It was the docks in London in the 50s. London docks were carrying their highest tonnages, if not they weren't all still open in the late 60s. So the docks were still an amazingly successful place, transformed by that's not a particularly recent photograph actually, but by the year 2000, an extraordinary change in one area. Now there were reasons for that, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And then, even more surprising than that, this is the demography. So actually, if we start this side, so the overseas born proportion of the London population, which in the 1930s and up to the 50s and 60s was under 10%. So there was lots of foreign-born people in Britain, people who came here because of the Second World War, people here before that, people who came because of international connections. London was always a fairly international city. But if you look what's happened from there to 2021, I'd say today the overseas-born proportion of the population, given the massive spike in immigration in the last 2 or 3 years, probably nearer 47% now, 46, 47%, so nearly half. That compares with New York's figure of 36%, okay? Okay, so substantially more overseas. But more surprising than that is this side, really, which is the slightly clunky terms white British and non-white British. I say clunky because white British, lots of us in the room are going to be white British, but non-white British is a slightly clunky Office for National Statistics measure, which sort of puts, an American who's just arrived, from working in banking with a third-generation Caribbean teenager in one group. So it's not perfect as a measure, but if we just aim off for that complication, the white British population of London in 1951 was 99%. 99%. And so it was vastly more homogeneous than the United Kingdom is today. I mean, whether you think this is a good or a bad thing, we'll park for another day. But that figure has gone up almost continuously, arriving now here where the non-white British population is the non-white British population is over 60%. Now, the actual non-white minority population is probably just under 50%, to give you a sense. But the point I'm making here is this is a spectacular change to take place in such a short period. And however, whatever the reasons for it, there are a mixture of, it starts with Windrush and London not having enough people to work for London Transport and for the National Health Service. And then through a middle period, the UK joins the EU, and then there's freedom of movement, and then that stops. And then and suddenly we leave the EU and immigration goes up even faster. Now, you can park the ironies and paradoxes there too. But anyway, enough about this. The demography of London has changed, and of course, in a way that is doubly difficult for UK policymakers, particularly in the latter part of this period. London's become so successful, it's an embarrassment to public policy. So it's simultaneously got these very high levels of immigration and overseas-born population, which are related but not the same thing, and its economy is growing faster than the rest of the UK. So that makes it very difficult to fit in terms of any of the conventional narratives. So, the past and statistics. I don't want photographs, but some people, I think some of the photographs I'm going to show you, people in the room may have actually taken part in the protests at the time, but I thought we'd just go there. This is my favourite. This is Thomas Square. Anybody here involved in the Thomas Square? There we are, I knew there'd be somebody. This is Thomas Square. As recently as 1979, the kind of housing which we'd all recognise today as being, it was sort of, I'm guessing, early Victorian, but the sort of stuff you'd see all over Kensington and all over, it was, most of it survived in North Kensington and in Paddington, though not all even there. So this was just after the squatting had been stopped by, and it was a complete, you'll know the story better than me, a sort of mixture of Camden Council, who eventually, I think, bought out the developers who'd done the other side, Joe Levy and others, who bought the other side of this. So that's the stretch from effectively just opposite Warren Street to just opposite Great Portland Street. And that had all been done as a speculative development by British Land, I think it was British Land. They're going to do the same on this side, but in the end, Camden sort of stepped in and did something rather different. What ended up here was actually contemporary social housing. So again, that's within the last 60, I've got that right, 50, 60 years in central London. This is what it's going to be. I mean, this is, if the Euston world of skyscrapers really has to pay for high speed too, it won't look like this. This is a rather delicate design by Atkins. But since then, Atkins, well, some people who worked with Atkins, but the point is, you know, in the great scheme of things, this looks, you know, rather nice. Whereas subsequently, the government announced it was going to try to pay for the whole of the extension from Old Oak Common to here by effectively building, and it would, I think somebody calculated it'd be about 5 Canary Wharfs would have to go on this Euston site, whilst avoiding the sight lines to St Paul's, no less. So, but again, the point is, even if this doesn't happen by 2033, it's clear that Euston is about to go through something like this, and about like some of these other places. And this is a few yards from Thomas Square. Don McCullin is his best. This is a picture of Spitalfields. It's true, it's in black and white, and it's taken by Don McCullin, and it's supposed to look like this. But again, this is the early 80s in Spitalfields. And again, many people in the room will remember this very clearly. And of course, courtesy of Google Street View, it looks like that. You know, more efforts, more learning about streetscape and the use of bollards. This is in Tower Hamlets. This is not in the city, actually, so it's a bollard-rich environment, like the city, but with Christchurch at the end there. And you have to say, not only does this show you that the city has changed radically, but also, and changed for the good, but also learned a great deal about how urban interventions, what they feel like, what they look like on the streets. And then there's the docks. This is one of my favourite shops. It's a screen grab from the film The Long Good Friday, when Bob Hoskins and his friend, played by Helen Mirren, are going up the docks here. Totally deserted, and of course Harold gives his great speech about an attack on Thatcherism, which turns out to be 100% predictive of that, which is what actually happened. This is not quite the same docks, but it's not far away. I mean, it's sort of just there. So, again, this takes place in a, 45-year period, and it's still ongoing. So I think I've made this point by now. The point I'm making is London could do these remarkable changes, and the degree of change in the last 40 or 50 years from a city which I thought many people thought was going to, and the GLC were predicting that London's population would go down to 5 million, then 5.5 million. And so complete reversal of that, with the population now up to 9, and this massive pressure. Having said that, given all the housing that's been built, if you look at the increase in the population from 1986, when the population reached its lowest, to today, that's 2 million up in that period, or 2.25 million up. Roughly half of them have been housed in new homes, and half in homes that were already built in 1985. So there's a re-densification of the existing stock, and only half the people now living here who weren't here in 1985 are living in new housing. Now, I'm going to talk about the decades of change, which I'm happy to say most people in the room have lived through. Not everybody, many of them. Most of you seem to, many of you lived through all of them. And of course, these are not real decades. TV's taken over.
I've got a thing which says the TV is going to be turned off in a minute. So.
Well, it's quite good. Excellent. So, and those of you who will remember the 60s, well, no, the 60s didn't really start in 1960, nor did they end the dead halt in 1970. And following that logic, I've created these sort of de facto decades in order just to simplify the kind of things, it's not everything obviously, that have gone on in London over this 60-year period, decade by decade. So if we take the 60s, obviously the first thing to point to is the remarkable progressive social reforms. Remember when Andrew Marr did his excellent series about Britain in the 20th or the late 20th century, I'll just take that off there if I lose track of time. He made the point that we are all to some degree children of Roy Jenkins's social reforms of the late 60s and Mrs. Thatcher's economic reforms of only 12, 13, 14 years later. They were in real time much closer to each other than they now feel. So progressive social reforms, you know, I'm not actually saying swinging London, but, you know, that's what it was deemed by Time and others. The end of the office boom, there'd been a great big office boom, which had led to the evils of congestion as the London County Council saw it. And that, of course, created the start of constraints on central London office building. Hard to believe such a thing happened, but the Location of Offices Bureau, the constraints put on by George Brown, not Gordon Brown, not so George, not Gordon, constraints on central London office buildings. Best thing that happened to developers ever at the time. All their rents went up. It was absolutely wonderful for them. Final years of mass social housing construction. This was the point when there'd been a 20-year period, 25-year period of mass social housing building and private housing, market housing building in London post-war. And this was just the point when doubts began to arise. When I was writing a book about the London boroughs at 50, I found a marvellous piece of film, which is probably still on YouTube, about an elderly lady, official term, who'd been moved out of a slum, they'd have to be a slum, without indoor toilet and bathroom and anything, into a GLC property. And she said, it's like, I feel as if I'm treated like a princess. And that sense that this remarkable social and for individuals physical change had occurred. But by the end of the 60s, there was just Ronan Point happens around this point, and there's some doubts, social change, making it harder to manage the public spaces within social housing estates. But still, the end of social housing, the beginning of the end of mass social housing construction, and of course, in 1965, the creation of the current GLC in the boroughs. The boroughs incredibly durable. I'll come back to that later. Then another not quite fitting to the decade, sort of 72 to 81, sort of punk London, pessimism, this is such heroic stuff, replacing the sort of 60s hippie, utopian, you know, all of that, some of you will actually remember that. So that all that social and economic change, the hope that had come with the 60s, dashed by the reality of what at the time looked like low economic growth, though by today's standards it was a permanent raging boom, but that's another matter. And then the population started to fall in London very quickly, and this was not just important because of population and the economy to some degree moving out, remembering that all those stumps, those 60s concrete stumps of hotels, the one that look, the sort of ones that are all over central London, were in part a result from the 70s government giving subsidies to hotels per room to try to build back the central London economy because there was a shortage of work in inner and central London. So another Labour government then starts to subsidise hotel building in London because of the rapid population and jobs decline, not so much in central London, but in inner London, because of deindustrialisation. Not just the end of the docks, but including the end of the docks, and the fact that all manner of heavy industry, some of which were still, even today there are vestiges of textiles in Fitzrovia. You can still just about see them, and it's not unique to that there. So very radical and rapid deindustrialisation, and the evolution of a fully declined inner city London. Again, I won't take a show of hands for this one, but I certainly have got a whole section of a bookshelf devoted to, often written by genteel Marxists, books about declined inner city London and squatting and the police and race relations and all of that between about 1974 and 1981. So we all know what that looks like, and it looked a bit like the Tolmer Square picture I've shown you and the Spitalfields pictures I've shown you. Then we arrive at another non-decade, really, from 81 to 90, what I call peak Thatcher, when Mrs. Thatcher had got her mojo. By this time, Thatcherism had become a thing. Mrs. Thatcher was quite happy to put an end to it, traditional manufacturing, not only in London, coal, steel, cars, anything really, providing it allowed the new economy to emerge. And the new economy wasn't facilitated by, but alongside that, big bang deregulation in the financial services in the city, right to buy social housing, terribly controversial, but how many people on the centre left do I know who privately admit they thought it was a good idea, even though it's very bad for the capacity for the state to hold social housing. The GLC, having only just been created, is now abolished in 1986, as it happens at the very point London's population is its lowest. Also, towards the end of in the 80s, you see the London, well actually before the GLC was abolished, the creation of the London Docklands Development Corporation. Now, it's always wrong to say one single thing made a difference, particularly with Eric sitting in the room. However, it's hard not to see the LDC both as a symbolic creation and in terms of the way it worked and what it delivered, not being a very important pin in the map as to the creation of the new London. The idea that the dear old Docklands Joint Committee, an effort by the GLC and the local boroughs to protect docking and related trades was not going to work. So Mrs. T comes along with the LDDC, which was a fascinating mixture of total free market liberalism and lots of public money and controls, all, sort of classic government paradox. But this is still a point where the tube and buses are in decline, and leading to, and much understatedly important document produced by the then Transport Secretary Paul Shannon, the Central London Rail Study. Central London Rail Study, like the LDDC, very important in beginning to articulate something about how London could change, or should change, or might change. And the CLRS effectively had in it Jubilee Line extension, both Crossrails 1 and 2, loads of other improvements. And the very fact it was published led to a debate and pressure to get things done and to deliver improved public transport, not just by the building of new lines, but eventually by the ill-fated public-private partnership for the underground. In the 90s, which I'm sort of taking from 1990 to 97, before the arrival of the Blair government, even under John Major's government, this really is John Major's government, the emergence of London World City. Those of you who remember the London Planning Advisory Committee, LPAC's, report on this subject, articulated something which was a debate that hadn't really occurred before. People thought that London, Paris, Berlin were kind of global, New York were global cities, obviously in the 20s and 30s. But the idea that there were these world cities with global functions, global tourism, global airports, global financial services, definitely hardens up at this point. London wants to see itself in that way. And I'd argue that the LPAC World City Report was very important in affecting the London plans that have come ever since and the whole way we think about the city. Population and economic resurgence begins at this point, and the start of public transport reinvestment, nearly done through these. This is a very odd decade, 1997 to 2008, so it's effectively Tony Blair's period in office, not Gordon Brown's, sorry. This creates the mayor and the assembly, Americanized version of city government. Population grows by 1 million in a decade, an extraordinary rate of growth by contemporary standards. The evolution of sort of Notting Hill London narrative, sort of rom-com version of London. I was watching on the other night a bit of Bridget Jones' film. You can just see it, this was a later one. This sort of sun-tinted, wonderful world that Richard Curtis and others created, without question. A sort of version of London, whether you like it or not. And then, of course, by this point, massive revival of East London, not just in Docklands, but we're now running up to, by this point, the Olympics has been won in 2005, massive change at Stratford, taking us into another ill-located decade from Gordon Brown through to really 2022. That is the end of Boris Johnson, where London in this period is seen as overperforming the UK to the point it's an embarrassment, and that somehow Brexit, when it happens as a vote, is seen as a way of testing how badly behind other parts of the country have become, and that we now need to level up so that policy should turn away from London with its riches and its railways and its Bridget Jones and all of that. And, no more evidence could you have of that than the Overground and the Elizabeth line, these remarkable pieces of new infrastructure. The Overground being in many ways the most efficient per mile of track ever built, an enormously clever thing to have done. The Elizabeth line, wonderful, but for different reasons. And then I start again from 2022, because I do think the arrival of Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak, obviously Liz Truss for an hour or two, then Rishi Sunak, they, because they're economic liberals, they just wanted London to grow again. They weren't interested in all this levelling up stuff. So levelling up dies almost immediately with them, whatever the government says. So we're back to London's, I exaggerate faintly for effect, but that London by this time is beginning to, the government accepts that it needs London's growth and productivity. We see the return of mass immigration, not for the first time recently. That will push the population up, particularly the overseas-born population up. And of course, the emergence of tech and bioscience as industrial leaders are sort of tilting away from financial and business services towards new industries, which, although they're certainly lower in terms of GDP per head in the short term, can be much bigger in the long term, depending on how they all turn out. So now we get to Whither London this time. So, where's the population going to go running ahead? Well, the GLA produces projections. These, in fairness to them, are projections based on, if you look back 5 years, 10 years, or 15 years. Obviously, if you look back 15 years, the trend was faster upwards than it has been slightly than in the last 10. The last 5 years, it's much slower because particularly COVID led to a large number of people leaving London. Most of them have come back, it would appear, though we don't have very good data about that. So, depends. But it seems to me, if you look at the significant uptick in international immigration in the last 2 or 3 years, which, of course, immigration is going to fall quite sharply in the next year or so, whoever's in power. But all the projections from the Office for Budget Responsibility and others suggest that a degree of international immigration will continue to be necessary just to run public services, if nothing else. So it looks to me as if that middle projection, and that would mean London reaching 10 million in 2050, so not as fast as it used to be thought it would happen, but that is still 40,000 a year every year more people, 40,000 a year every year, and that's in London, not the wider southeast, which, if history is to be our guide, will be growing faster. This is another unreadable chart. What this is showing is, we're now a much shorter period looking forward. This is simply recent trends, and I wish I'd said over what period, but this is the recent economy, showing that in the last 5 or 6, I think it's actually over 7 or 8 years, that manufacturing and construction are in decline, transport and storage are in decline. This is in London. But what's growing? Tech, obviously, financial and insurance services still, particularly insurance and professional and technical activities, and of course, actually, interestingly, health and social work, not just the public sector, but public and private sector. These are all sectors which are growing fast in London and which are growing fast elsewhere in the world. So it looks as if London's capacity to grow by growing new sectors, it's the flexibility of its workforce, and indeed it's the investment in the city, will carry the economy forward, not as fast as in the past, but faster than the UK. Sorry, in no particular order, not as fast as in the past, probably faster than the UK, and not far away from the European average for big cities. Just getting to the election now, what about planning and development? Well, hard to disentangle the discussion of this from what's in the two major parties, Liberal Democrats and Scottish Nationalists implied in the room. I'll just stick with these two parties. Conservative, let's deal with them first, not because they're less likely perhaps than Labour to win the election, but because they did have this extraordinary commitment, which is a repeat of something that was already Conservative policy, which is raising the density levels in inner London to those of European cities like Paris and Barcelona. This will ensure the London plan delivers more family homes a year, forcing the mayor to plan for more homes on brownfield sites like underused industrial land. We will regenerate major sites such as Euston, world of skyscrapers, Old Oak Common and Thamesmead. Now, of course, this is a position that Michael Gove had got to some months ago, and it was a way of trying to square off the need to build loads of houses with no targets anymore outside London, loads of homes, no targets outside London, still targets in London because of the London plan, lots of opposition in outer London from Conservative MPs with marginal constituencies to development. So the way we get around that is by building in inner and central London at scale. And if you do the numbers, to get to Barcelona, central London, I think he was talking about, we would have to grow by 1 million, 1.25 million, and Paris 2 million or 2 million. I mean, remarkable. So this was more a sort of position rather than an actual policy. If we go to Labour, now Labour are interesting in this regard too, because Labour, polls suggest are more likely to take office. And one of the things that they're clearly focused on is making the planning system or changing the planning system to develop faster and to develop more. Now, many in the room will know more than me about whether changing the planning system would for and of itself deliver much more. But that's what they clearly think, that somehow a bit of liberalisation, a next generation of new towns. These are going to be new communities with beautiful homes, green spaces, reliable transport links, and bustling high streets. That's good. So all I'd say is that even if you look at Milton Keynes, the acme of the reasonably recent new towns, I think Milton Keynes' population today is about 250,000, is it? Something like that, 250,000. It uses, to house that many people, 15 times as much land as Tower Hamlets. So it's, it's going to take a lot of new towns, given the 40,000 going every year in London, and probably significantly more than that in the wider London region. So anyway, new towns, unleashing mayors, that's devolution to mayors, a planning passport for urban brownfield development with a fast-track approval and delivery of high-density housing on urban brownfield and so on. So, I mean, they're not that far away, of course, when you start digging down into all of this. These are, but first dibs for first-time buyers. There we are, supporting younger people, the first chance at homes in new housing developments with a government-backed mortgage guarantee scheme. So both parties, of course, as ever, never quite far away, subsidising demand rather than subsidising supply. But there we are. So that's what's lying ahead there. I thought we should do a bit of politics, it being election week nearly. So this is what the famous MRP polls are showing for London. So I've marked all the remaining Conservative constituencies: Romford, Hornchurch and Upminster, Old Bexley and Sidcup and Orpington, all on the east of the city, as you can see. I'd be personally surprised if they had lost Ruislip, Northwood and Pinner, but we'll see. So it's not looking good. Lib Dems inching their way further in from the southwest, you can see, so any Lib Dems in the audience. Now, London's always been a Labour city, hasn't it? We always knew that. Well, no. Because courtesy of Wikipedia, the only place I could actually find a map for this was the local election results in 1968. And actually, in the 1979 general election, Mrs Thatcher won her majority almost entirely because of big swings to the Conservatives in London. And what's happened in the meantime, and there's some very good research going on at Queen Mary about this, I'll stop soon, is that the population's got significantly younger, significantly more from minorities, and significantly more from people who are, for all sorts of other related cultural reasons, more likely to vote the modern Labour Party, not the former one. This is a very hard to read chart, which I've made myself. What it does is to compare the vote share in London with the vote share in Britain. And as you can see here, where you get these bars very close to the line, it means that the vote share for the parties, so if we take 1959, for the Conservative and Labour parties, their London vote share was exactly the same as the national vote share. So London was more like GB than any other region in the country. In the northeast, Labour would have done better. In the southeast, the Conservatives better. And thus it continues, really. The odd year when it's better for Labour, the odd year when it's better for the Conservatives, and then Mr Blair takes office. And probably not just Mr Blair, but from then on, the Labour Party does far, far better, and the Conservatives increasingly badly. And all I can say is, I think the Labour gain and the Conservative loss have levelled out. I think this is as bad as it will get for the Labour Party. It doesn't mean the Conservatives are going to win seats in the coming election, because here's a chart. So this is looking at the London vote share and seats by party, another unreadable one really. But if you look at this, the lowest number of seats the Conservatives have had ever, and this would have been ever if you go back further, is 11 in 1997. The Conservatives doing pretty well in 1992, as recently as John Major's unexpected victory. The median, the average of all the polls and MRPs suggests they'll get 7, could be 4, could be 3, could be 8. Labour's going to get its biggest number of seats ever, but the swings to London will be slower than in the rest of the country. The swings are far bigger in the Midlands and the North than this, so this will be a low swing to Labour in London. There's a poll out today showing in London alone, Labour on 55 and the Conservatives on 22. I think the Conservatives would settle for 22 in London. Be a good result for them, really, looking at some of these polls. Lib Dems could get 6. That would take them very close to Conservative total for the first time ever. And I'm assuming, controversially, this has all been recorded, so when I get this wrong, you all know, Jeremy Corbyn might win. So that's what that is. Don't know about that? Yeah. Any of the voters from Islington North here? We'll discuss this later. So looking ahead, nearly done. By 2074, let's wait, 20 years out, 50 years out from now, hard not to see London as a city of 11 to 12 million within a region of 30. If the UK population goes on growing, there are constraints on building in green belt and greenland more generally, desire to rebuild in cities, London's population will gently increase. It's worth remembering that even today, the average density of population in Greater London is about the same as Ealing's density. So there's plenty of space, plenty of capacity to go here. There'll be some debate about whether London's boundaries need to expand to encompass more. Everywhere around it will resist very, very much, as they did in 1962-64 when it was discussed, or 59 to 65. So that will be discussed. And I would say it's almost inevitable there'll be some incursion of building into the green belt. Labour, by calling it a grey belt, seem to be heading in that direction. Hard to see there will not be, I wouldn't say much, but some incursion into the green belt. Though it's one of those things where the Mayor and the Labour Party nationally are not on the same page, of course. I think we'll see a more powerful Mayor with more devolved power, not massively more. England's a very centralised country. But London's demographic and political differences compared with most of the rest of the UK probably imply moves towards a greater city-state style logic of itself. It is different to the rest of the country. And as other city regions, and not only city regions, get their own autonomy, that will mean they're all pushing in the same direction. I think the boroughs will live on. As I mentioned this earlier, they're 60 years old, amazingly long-lived by the standards of local authorities in the United Kingdom. London, by far the oldest left. And of course, if they follow the 11 or 12 million logic, several of them are soon going to have a population of 500,000, which makes them bigger than many cities, of which more in a moment, outside London. I think we'll see further debates about the need for a new neighbourhood level of government to increase trust. Trust in British politics is low. The further down the system you get, the more people trust it. I don't think efforts there are quite finished yet. So there might be more powers over planning, housing, development and community investment to a sub-London level. Don't quite know how that would work, but I can see that might happen. We can already see bigger outer London sub-centres with their own tall downtowns. This is an extraordinary phenomenon. If you go to New York or to Paris, cities that have much in common with London, they do not have loads of sort of mini Manhattans arriving all over the outer part of the city. Although the Manhattans, I might call them mini central Londons now. But if you go to Ilford or to downtown Lewisham, North Acton, twice I think in North Acton, certainly, Croydon again. So there's several parts of the city where you've got these Walthamstow sprouting tall buildings in outer London. Transport and travel in inner London sets to be even less car dependent than today, though I do think outer London will remain substantively different. It's very hard to get outer London public transport, certainly in the current configuration. Obviously technology may move along a long way here. It is undoubtedly still, and the pushback against ULEZ, though it didn't actually in the end do for Sadiq Khan, is clearly a real thing. I'm not saying it's right, but it's clearly a real thing. And I think central London, which has already been moving in this direction for decades and just slightly speeded up by COVID and people working from home, will move further towards being a sort of leisure, tourism, cultural focus alongside its traditional office retail one. And that's been going on. I say that the concept of central London in this version of itself didn't really exist until the 90s. Nobody talked about central London and in the way we think of it today as a massive hub for leisure, tourism and culture. It was always, to some extent, those things, but much more important to the UK and to itself economically now. So just to, go back to where I began, as always with London, so much is the same, there's this, so much is the same, and yet so much is different all the time. And then briefly, I made the point about how powerful London is. Many of you will see this is a version of this, just to show you how big London is compared with other cities in the other parts of the country. You have to be careful. I wouldn't say this is, this is not a reason for saying, isn't London wonderful? It isn't that. I don't make it for that point. Just to make the point that how difficult it is for cities outside London to have the kind of economic and productive firepower that London is able to do almost naturally. And this is just as a London. If you talk about the wider region, we saw the numbers earlier. And then last but not least, we've all seen these. This was a tube poster drawn in 1926 of what London would look like in 2026. And actually, more of it's right than it's wrong. If you think about it. The loads of tall buildings they got right. The slightly strange sets of tops they certainly got right, though I think there's rather more Gothic here than they were envisaging, from the print in New York perhaps. Stuff flying around the sky, well they're not drones, but they're going to be drones and private taxis soon enough. So actually, well, somebody in the room will know who drew this, but I don't, but it's not as far away as you think. And then of course I found this one for something else I was doing. It may have been on Peter's or something, anyway. What a 2020's view of the future now looks like. And again, it's still got lots of tall buildings with funny shaped tops and stuff flying around the sky. So perhaps that's just the future. Thank you very much.
I just had a couple of comments. I think one about the importance of destruction in London for its ability to change, of which Great Fire obviously was the first, but also after the Blitz, when we had the IRA in 1993, which allowed the Eastern Cluster to actually happen. It wouldn't have happened otherwise. But to get more recent, you commented on Outer London and transport there. I remember Michelle Dix giving a talk when Boris was mayor, saying there's no money to put in any infrastructure in Outer London, so everyone will have to carry on using cars, which I thought was a bit mean for all those people now who've been complaining about ULEZ, because actually that is a response to policy. But then the other point you make on that last slide is about one of the last slides, the West End and the city becoming more leisure-oriented. And that is what's happening here in the City of London, where destination city is a key part of what they're trying to do. Do you think actually that is going to replace the absent workers and the city can retain its role in the future?
Yeah, I mean, providing doesn't move too much. I mean, we all know, those of you who are not involved in planning, which I'm not, I mean, trying to get the balance between what's here now, which produces these incredibly high levels of economic output and productivity. Productivity not as good as it once was, by the way, but that's not it's a London problem within a UK problem. But London's not its productivity has been growing more slowly in recent years than the UK's, which is not a good sign. It's still much higher, but it's not growing as fast as the UK's. So I think inner and central London can take a great deal more of the move towards art, culture, leisure, and so on, providing it can keep alongside it, which wouldn't be so difficult, the very high value added things that love to be near all of that. So, we all know about, hedge funds and private equity people who want to be in Mayfair because they're near all the nice cultural facilities and the restaurants and all of that. But they do want to be near all of that. So providing, I think it's very difficult for places that become completely dependent. I mean, a wonderful place though it is, Venice is an incredibly successful place in terms of culture, leisure, recreation, tourism, but its economy is weak. So you need these things living alongside each other. I think the city can take office buildings and people selling Mexican food and out here. I mean, I think, and the city corporation, as ever, is very good at judiciously mixing the old with the new. So I think and the West End is more organic. But yeah, providing, and that's why I think the central London boroughs have been very careful to try to exempt themselves from too much permitted development that allows changes of use, which means you get, push out commercial uses that are attractive, to people wanting to work and indeed visit central London.
Right, Ben, you put your hand up. Tell who you are, Ben.
Oh, sorry, Ben Plowden, ex-Transport for London, now a variety of other things related to transport cities. I was interested in your 2074 account. You didn't talk about the impacts of climate change.
True.
Where it seems highly likely that most of central London will be underwater. Literally underwater, and will also be experiencing catastrophic drought at the other end of that equation. And it seems to me that we're not thinking anything like hard enough about the fact that London will, like everywhere else, but particularly London, given where it is in the country, will be dramatically affected by the climate change already underway, and how that affects your broader view of people eating fast food in the street, that kind of stuff.
It's a very reasonable challenge, and I suppose what it's one of those things which it's so hard to, bit like I didn't talk about AI, let's straight go there. Now I didn't talk about AI either, and I didn't talk about either for the sort of the same reason, which is that it's very hard to know which of the various output or outcomes of climate change or indeed AI will work in what particular way. So I've sort of assumed a sort of broadly consistent state here. So in a sense, you can see that climate change will require adaptation in London, obviously. It will require adaptation. Not to make light of a serious matter, I was amazed the Thames Barrier got built before rather than after London had been flooded. I mean, I know it was in part a response to the floods on the East Coast in the early 1950s, but the Thames Barrier did get built. And so, I see that events, and Peter made this point, it's absolutely spot on. Events will trigger change with climate change. London's building codes were triggered by the Great Fire. Again and again, cholera epidemics triggered the building of sewers. So I fear, as with many things, we'll have to wait for events to trigger the pressure on politicians to deliver changes when it comes to climate change. So that's probably why I left it out, and I left AI out as well, because I went to an event recently, you might have been there too, well, Peter, where a speaker effectively made the point that AI could either be the most wonderful thing in the world ever and we're all going to be happier, or it'll kill us. And that's quite a wide range of things to build into a projection like this. So, but it's a good challenge. But I seriously, I think it will take events to trigger the political pressure to deliver change. And then the question is, and people are going to say, is London going to, it'll be worse off in many ways, but other things may be beneficial, and you have to work out which they are.
Lee Mallet, hello. London was offered cheap space and housing in the early 1980s, and everybody moved down from up north to take part in the growth in London. But now, the children of those people who moved down here and the children of people in London cannot afford housing. And do you think that the reduction in London's output is related to the increasing cost of housing? And should we build a lot more housing in London, or should we pursue levelling up and build the housing somewhere else?
I think it's a great question too. I think I'd be amazed if the extraordinary increase in rentals, which certainly lead people I know who were otherwise in my position when I was their age, to think they can never afford to buy a home, so they'll always be paid rent to a landlord forever. Whereas, so I think that and it's bound to affect productivity. I think fewer people will be able to live and work as close to live close to work as they otherwise would have been able to. It's bad because it discourages talent, young talent. It makes it more difficult for younger people. And it's, it's going off as a tangent, which I also didn't talk about, it's part of a terrible generational inequality, a desperate failure of public policy, which has allowed deep breath, older people to use the voting system, in some ways to benefit themselves against younger people. Now, I'm sorry to everybody in the room who's over the age of 50, but I fear that it includes me by a long way. I'm afraid that's true, and it's not good for this. And it would be amazing if the very significant increase in rents and the impossibility of buying hasn't dampened productivity. Trouble with, and I know you're not suggesting this, but levelling up by, because certainly some MPs who don't want development in their constituency, why don't we build all this housing in the north? Well, the trouble is, many places in the north have a housing problem, but it's not a cost-driven housing problem. One of the most intriguing charts I've seen in modern times was produced by the Resolution Foundation, and it showed the amount of housing wealth built up by the median household in each region of the country. So, housing wealth, net of mortgage, by each region of the country, people on median incomes. Top, southeast; second, east; third, Wales, I think it was; fourth, the northwest; make it up; bottom, London. Why is that? Because nobody on the median income could ever afford to buy a home in London. Right. So there are profound consequences of where we've ended up, and often invisible ones. So it's a great question, but so I don't think you could build homes in the Midlands and the North, and people would move there. The question is, aiming off of the Conservatives' slightly fanciful Barcelona and Paris idea, the idea of densifying London quite substantially more in an attractive way isn't a stupid or illogical thing to imagine doing. Indeed, there's a consensus to do it. Then the only question is how to get over all the barriers, which Labour apparently say they're going to. Well, we'll soon find out, perhaps.
You partly answered my question. Demographics, sorry, I'm Cardiff University, do future cities there and other places. So you talked about demographic numbers and also a diverse population, but London's always been a young city, or recently,
yeah.
And that's been part of our flexibility, but also our progressive nature. Is it going to still be a young city in 2072? And if not, does that flexibility, does that progressive nature die?
All great questions. Well, in no particular order, London is getting older. It's just getting older from a much younger base. The House of Commons Library produced an excellent document which you can get online, looking at the new parliamentary constituencies in London with all the demographic data about them. And there are some, I think it was the one that struck me most, in inner South London. I think is anybody here live in, is it called Streatham and Brixton? Is it one called Streatham and Brixton? Is that what it's called? Yeah. Which has an extraordinary population. It's got virtually no children, no older people. 10 really, and others aged sort of 35 to 55, enormous spike, and nobody on either side. So London is getting older. The whole of the UK is getting older, just that London's getting older from a much younger base. Will that affect well, the question of liberal attitudes is itself an intriguing one, because there's a fair amount of research evidence that shows attitudes in London to a range of social issues are not as liberal as in some other parts of the country. And the reason for that is quite a substantial proportion of the migrant population, the immigrant population, is often very religious. And it's social, so the view of some migrants, particularly religious ones, all religions, tend to be less socially progressive than the population they arrive to. So there's a very good piece of research done by a think tank called Theos about 3 or 4 years ago, which looked in detail at this. So I suspect that the fact the population is getting older won't make it less progressive. I don't think older people are as much progressive as younger people on a whole range of issues. I don't think it's that. It'll be more whether people become less religious the longer they live here. Complicated as it'll be recorded.
Eric Sorensen, then Pat Brown. Yeah.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much, Tony. A few random comments, if I may. One is, of course, it's very difficult to make generalisations about London. I live in
just done it
Islington, I worked in Romford, and I tell you that they couldn't have been more different. You know, the other one was, Romford was older people rushing off to Lidl, and in Islington we have a sourdough bread shop opening every week, and we've now got 9 within 300 yards of each other. It's quite extraordinary. But what I really wanted to focus on was your decades, and just add something particularly from the 1980s. London has experienced a number of beneficial changes under the broad heading of regeneration, many of which were by accident. So London LDDC, Docklands, which you rightly mentioned, it has said that the arrival of Canary Wharf was an accident, pure hubris and enthusiasm by the developers concerned, Olympia and York, and it would have been a very different place if they hadn't arrived, with much less good transport infrastructure. So the LDC, one reason or another, amazing transformation. Then we had, I think in rough sequence, Henry Brooke, who was in charge of the beginnings of the lottery, and he decided that the Millennium Commission would use lottery funds to do an enormous amount of big, heavyweight cultural investment, of which the obvious examples in London are Portrait Gallery, Tate Modern, British Museum, and many others. So it was an enormous benefit for quite over a very narrow period of about half a dozen years, where there was phenomenal investment in London's cultural benefit, which wouldn't have happened under a different government because it would have been much more social. They would have built community halls rather than invested in things like Tate Modern. The third thing was the Olympics, of course, which was a major investment impact, which still continues. And then there have been key investment opportunities, Battersea one hand, King's Cross in the other. But since then, nothing much has happened. So what concerns me, that if you look at London under Boris, which he just lived on the back of the Olympics decision, he didn't actually do very much. I'm not quite sure what I'd say Sadiq Khan, I know this is ad hominem stuff as opposed to just a wider change. So what has really changed in London over the last 20 years, and what can we see are going to be the drivers now? And you quite rightly talk about demographic change, and that's fine, but what happens is that GDP per head, by bringing in a lot of people who are going to go into relatively low wage bits of the economy, are going, in terms of GDP per head, are going to drive London not necessarily in the direction we want. That's not a comment, that's not a Farage type comment on immigration, it's just hopefully a comment about demographics and economics.
I mean, I'd say it's a good question again, and I'd say that the thing I missed out, which prompts me to say it like other things, is that since 2008, the banking crisis, I mean, the single event in contemporary British history that's had the biggest effect on London and indeed the UK's economy was the banking crisis. So not the pandemic, not Brexit, and not Mr. Putin's adventurism. These three things have had an effect, obviously, but the 2008, you can see it in this data, that the UK economy has grown more slowly, and London within it, since 2008. Trend changed and never recovered. Productivity has never recovered. So that, I think, explains why, I mean, London's growth rate remains anemic, but it's higher than the UK average. So, I mean, the UK's growth rate has been anemic. This will be the first government, I think I'm right in saying, to leave office since the war with real disposable income per head lower than when it took office, which is an extraordinary thing to have happened, and makes the 70s much maligned look like a period of blissful growth. All the way through, all the things that happened in the 70s, the economy was growing typically 2.5% a year. So the big change has been 2008, the banking crisis. And of course, London had a lot of banking in it. In many ways, it's recovered reasonably well. But I think that, so the question, there isn't quite an answer to your question, but I think that's led to less frothy growth, And the increase in immigration, which, I mean, it has to be discussed, it's an issue of public policy, it's in both parties' manifestos, all parties' manifestos, is for a complex array of reasons, but where, I mean, it's a mixture of the public sector doesn't pay enough to stop it. The state has visa schemes to allow people to come and work in health and social care. That explains a fair amount of it, not available to the private sector in the same way. Push factors, we know about the push factors, and then pull factors. And so I think if you add all of that up together, the question for me is, how do these new and emerging sectors, tech, bioscience, lots of investment in bioscience, somebody in the room will tell me whether there's too much investment in bioscience out there. Looks, the word bubble, occasionally comes to mind when I look at all the places that are setting up labs for that. So I think the question is, what drives the growth, the real growth in the economy in London in the future? And will the UK government allow investment in the infrastructure to allow London and the wider South East to continue the relatively successful economic progress of the past? Which leads to, final thought, the Office for National Statistics produced the most up-to-date figures on this the other week, 2 weeks ago. The transfer of tax from London to the rest of the country, the surplus between all the taxes paid in London and all public spending in London, is growing faster than ever. It's growing again. So there's a big shift and so the UK can't get away with needing the London economy to grow. That's my remarks about Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak. And I doubt Labour would change that, but we still don't have an answer, I'll stop saying this, to the question of what are the real growth sectors for the future? We're in between financial and business services tilts to some degree, but others potentially for the future.
Pat Brown.
Hi, thank you very much, Peter, and thanks, Tony, that was brilliant. And Rosemary Scanlon sent her very best wishes. She's been emailed.
She's published a book.
Your slides. Now, my point, I've got a point and a sort of question which goes from a lot of what was already being said. The point is, I disagree with you about New York. If you take Brooklyn and also Long Island City, clusters in Harlem and a whole host of things. There's a lot of density in outer, beyond Manhattan now. But my point was, I was looking at that slide for 10 million people living here and thinking, bloody hell, where's everybody going to live? And Lee made the point very eloquently about the fact that people are already being squeezed out of London. I think the other elephant in the room, besides Ben's climate change, is inequality. And which is absolutely heartbreaking in this city, and getting worse, not better. And a lot of that is down to very transient jobs, 0 hours contracts, and so on and so forth. And they're increasing as opposed. So we've got a growth economy in the wrong sectors in a way. And what was going through my mind, in whether it's the Tory line or whoever, is Mark Twain saying, by land we don't make it anymore, because London has to do an awful lot. And so can we really be a city of 10 million people? Can people afford to live here? Will people want to live here? It's a very contested and congested city already, where you're sort of dodging in and out of electric hire bikes, etc., which takes me to my final point, really, which is your point about governance and the way we do the sort of the trust. We haven't seen that in any of our mayors necessarily. You only have to look at the ULEZ debate to understand that we're not very good, and Ben and I and others in this room have been very involved in this, in making positive behaviour change happen. And so we've got to have behaviour change in order to be the city that we need to be. Sorry, lots packed into there.
So the first one was, so what was the second one? I got to remember the first, what was the middle one? Inequality, no, before we got to inequality.
And how will we all fit in? Is it even possible to actually think about that?
Certainly. Okay, let's do with that one first. If you'd said in 1985 London's population is going to grow by 2.5 million by 2022. I think people have said that's impossible. It's in the same boundaries. They just said that was impossible. And yet somehow, now, some of it's not very elegant, some of it leads to overcrowding and temporary buildings at the back of people's homes and all of that kind of thing. Some of it's not very good. Some of it leads to more efficient use of housing. So, as I said, 9 to 10, or it's even to 11, but 9 to 10, one person extra for every 9 that's here already. I think the city would be flexible enough to handle that. The inequality point is of course a very powerful one. Inequality is, as you know, always been present in London. It's not as if it's a new phenomenon. It manifests itself slightly. Some of it manifests itself in the same way, some of it differently. I would argue that is to some extent, only something the city can only partly deal with, because it's a byproduct of the economy the UK runs, which is national government's responsibility, and secondly, the way the benefits system and a whole range of other things national government do work out in London. It's very hard for London alone to mitigate the sum total of the UK economy as it turns up in London, which is not to say that people in City Hall and borough government shouldn't make an effort using the planning system and in other ways to mitigate it. But I don't think, I'll mention this to you before. I got a book at home which I endlessly refer to, written in the 70s for a Thames television programme called London the Heartless City. And what London the Heartless City had as its main theme was only the rich and poor can live in London these days. And it's a desperate place for people in every way you can imagine. And of course it did include housing statistics which are vastly worse than they are today. Housing may be bad today, but it's not as bad today as it was in 1975 for many people. Inside toilets, inside bathrooms, central heating, all sorts of things that didn't exist then. So not to in any sense to understate the importance of the inequality issue, but I do think boroughs and City Hall are always fighting with what they inherit from the UK government and tax and benefit system. New York, looked this up just to be sure. Of course, there is growth in downtown Brooklyn, Long Island, Upper Manhattan, but they're all on the edge of the existing core of Manhattan. If you go out into the outer boroughs, you don't have the equivalent of North Acton or the equivalent of Ilford, Broadway, and the cluster of towers there in the more flat outer boroughs. So they're extending Manhattan, but most of this, you'll have Long Island City and Brooklyn are both quite close into the existing or the original cluster. More interesting is what's hopped over the river to Jersey, but even that's close to Manhattan. It's all that's how I think it's different, because there's a difference between the borough structure. In New York, it suits the city to have all the real estate dollars paid where they are highest, whereas in the boroughs, they just give planning permissions for what they want in a way that New York wouldn't have to in the outer boroughs. I think it's something to do with that. We can discuss this over a drink.
Right, I think last question, probably, Robin.
Probably a tricky one. You're going to just swipe it away. But the word that is on everybody's lips is growth, and some of us think that actually we can't grow forever. So the question is, and the Labour has clearly committed itself to this. So what other options might exist for our cities if they don't have the material with which to grow them?
Right. I think the challenge with the difficulty with no growth, be it at the city or the national level, in my personal view, is that, look at the general election campaign that's going on at the moment. Both the Labour and Conservative parties desperately struggling to say what they'd spend more money on when there isn't any more money. And the IFS, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, comes out today saying it's all, hocus pocus, really, effectively. There isn't enough money to do even what they're promising, and nobody's given any figures for 2-3 years out for what all the sectors are going to get cut would otherwise need. So, I think the only way you could deliver little or no growth would be by a massive redistribution of wealth, and getting people to sign up to that is complicated, is all I can say. Because quite a lot of people who wouldn't think of themselves as very well off would have to be taxed more in order to protect and improve the public services, which everybody says that they want, both politicians and voters. And I think so the challenge of no growth is no more money for the NHS, to put it at its crudest, which is not to say it is impossible to deliver growth that has significantly less damaging environmental consequences. And in fairness to successive UK governments, the move away from burning coal and other fossil fuels in the UK towards renewables in the last 20 years is a miracle in some ways. It may not be good enough, but it's an extraordinary achievement compared with what's going on in many other parts of the world. So it seems to me the challenge is how to deliver growth. This is, of course, it's a cop-out, not standing for election, but how to deliver growth which is less and less harmful to the environment. I think that is the way of squaring the circle. Otherwise, there's just no money for all the public services the public appears to want.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Tony, for a splendid tale about London and its potential future. I think fascinating. Eric says how Canary Wharf was accidental. My view is that London is a pragmatic place. It does respond to events, and it probably will, as you say, in terms of a lot of issues around climate change. But it responded to events after the Great Fire. It responded to events after the Blitz, and it reinvents itself very quickly, as you've shown. And I think it's very interesting to see what actually does happen, both after a new government, but also we are in a new phase where that, as you say, that huge investment, that spurt of growth, which you see every half century or so happening in London, that spurt of growth, has it slowed down, or is that investment coming from elsewhere? And indeed, at the moment, it's really quite remarkable. You think a couple of years after the end of COVID, that actually the City of London has, Andrew Reynolds will remind me, so 12 new towers, I think, which are being planned. Whether they'll all be built, who knows? But
one thing, I know we've got to stop, but one,
yes.
I know everyone wants to have a glass of wine, not as much as I do. One thing I didn't say, and maybe Pat didn't pounce on this as well, which would have been a good thing to pounce on. I highlighted lots of places that have changed and radical changes occurred, but of course there are significant parts of London, particularly parts of the outer inner London boundary, or the outer inner edge, and some of them in outer London, which are very, very much not like this regenerated world that I've been talking about. Huge swathes of places where the housing, people who own the housing can't afford to maintain it, and areas which have not had investment, and so that and I should have highlighted them, because there's many square miles of London which is not full of the kind of gentrified improvement that I've been looking at. So worth thinking about that too. Sorry, you reminded me I should have said
Okay,
that.
well, we can talk about it over a drink. So if you'd like to thank Tony and